Jesus chose the Garden of Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives. Gethsemane means oil press. It was a place where there was an oil press there where they would press the olives and extract the oil that they would use for cooking, for medicinal purposes. It was such a valuable asset. But this is where Jesus went. He went to a very familiar place. The appointed place was the garden, because this was the place where Jesus and his disciples had gathered many, many times. It was a secluded place. Verse 2, now Judas also, who was betraying him, knew the place, for Jesus had often met there with his disciples. It was a quiet place where Jesus could go with his disciples to get away from the crowds, to spend time in prayer, and simply just enjoy time with the disciples. It's interesting, Jesus knew this place. His disciples knew it because they had been there many, many times. But church, this was the appointed place. It could have happened in the streets. As we put together kind of a timeline of the last few days, Jesus had been very public. In John chapter 11, Jesus raised Lazarus from the grave. Remember that? John chapter 12, the Jews began to plot how they could kill Jesus and put Lazarus to death also. We see Jesus entering into Jerusalem, very public display. I mean, the triumphant entry there, the Palm Sunday entrance on that Sunday, he was very public. He goes into the temple. He cleanses the temple, which made the Jews even madder. So Jesus had not tried to hide in any way. Jesus had not tried to avoid them in any way. If they had wanted to arrest him publicly, they could have done that. They had every opportunity. But the Jews feared the crowds. They were afraid that if they tried to take Jesus in a public setting, that the crowds would riot. And this was a very public setting because this was the feast of the Passover. And there were thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews who had come to Jerusalem for this Passover. So if they had tried to arrest Jesus publicly, they were afraid what might happen. And indeed, it could have been a very bad situation. Riots, the disciples themselves could have been killed in the riot. We don't know. Do you know what I know in their hearts and minds also? They feared Jesus. They were afraid of Jesus. They were afraid of his power. They were afraid of who he really was. So the garden was the ideal place. Going to the garden, Jesus eliminated the possibility of a riot, with many people being killed and possibly even some of his own disciples. The garden was the place. This was the place, John says, that they knew very well. Judas knew it very well, and Jesus knew that Judas knew. See, there's the key. Jesus knew that Judas was aware of the fact that this was the place he would go to. This is the place where he would be. The reason Jesus went to the garden is because he knew that's where Judas would come looking for him. And it was the appointed place. Secondly, we see the appointed time. The last thing that Jesus did Judas was, what you do quickly. Time was of essence because this was the hour, this was the time. Jesus knew that his last hour had come. My hour, up until that point, Jesus had said continually, my hour has not come. It's not time yet. But now Jesus is saying, now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. Up until this time, Jesus had avoided his enemies. They had tried on several occasions to capture him, but the time wasn't right. In John chapter 7, the Jewish leaders had sent the police, the temple guard, out to capture Jesus. And they came back without him. They'd asked the guard, why did you not bring him in? The guard simply responded, never has a man spoken the way this man speaks. I mean, they just couldn't handle it. In John chapter 8, they tried to capture him. They picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Why? Because it wasn't time yet. In John chapter 10, it says, therefore they were seeking again to seize him, and he eluded their grasp. But this night, this time, in this place, it was different. Jesus doesn't elude them. Jesus doesn't try to slip through the crowds. Look at there. Jesus goes out to meet them. Jesus went forth and he said to them, verse 4, whom do you seek? Why? Because this was the appointed time for Jesus to die. He could not have died before the Passover. This was the celebration of the Feast of the Passover, where every Jew would come to Jerusalem. They were celebrating the Passover, where they had taken, when they were in Egypt, when the death angel came, they took the blood of the lamb and they put it over their doorposts. And every place where the doorpost was covered with blood, the death angel would pass over. But where there was no blood, the death angel would go in and the eldest son was killed. So the Jews celebrated that feast, the Feast of the Passover, and they would come to Jerusalem for that feast. Now, the Lamb of God was going to be slain. This was the time. This was the fulfillment of the picture, of the Old Testament picture God had given us, that now one lamb, the Lamb of God, was going to be slain, and His blood was going to be purchased to purchase salvation for once for all time. And that we were going to be redeemed not with silver or gold, but with precious blood as of a lamb, unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ. He was the Passover lamb that would be slain for the sins of all men. So we see God's timing. We see God's place. God knew exactly when to do and where to do what He wanted to do. Thirdly, we see the appointed people. Quickly, let me mention the key people. First, there were His disciples. His disciples were there with Him in the garden. Now, Jesus could have sent His disciples somewhere else. He could have gone into the garden all by Himself. And I'm sure that once He was captured, then word would have spread pretty quickly to the disciples that something has happened to Jesus. But Jesus wanted the disciples there for a purpose. I'm sure if they had heard about His capture, they would have kind of thought about it and said, well, you know, Jesus, I bet He put up a good fight. I bet He didn't go down easy. Jesus was a carpenter. He was a man's man. I bet He put up a good fight. But Jesus wanted them to know that He didn't put up a fight. They didn't take His life. He was not trapped. He was not tricked. But He went forth to meet them, and He willingly laid down His life for them. Jesus wanted His disciples to see that He was not captured. He wanted to see that they did not take His life, but He would willingly lay down His life for His sheep. He wanted them there in order to see His power and to experience one last time in this life His protective love, how He was going to protect them. He wanted them there. This He kept them to fulfill the prophecy or the word that He had spoken in chapter 17, verse 12, of those whom you have given me, I lost not one. So the disciples were there. Judas was there. Judas was there for a purpose. He came to betray Christ. Now, there have been a lot of people who've tried to explain away the motives of Judas or try to give Judas some good intentions. Some have said that Judas was simply trying to force Christ's hand, that he wanted to set up his kingdom here, and he thought it was an earthly kingdom, so he was just trying to bring Jesus and the Jews together so he would overthrow the Romans, the Jews, and set up his kingdom. And that Judas really did have noble purposes or noble designs, but that's not true. We can discern the true nature of Judas in several ways. First, John tells us that when Judas left the upper room, Satan entered into him. Now, it's one thing to be demon-possessed, but when Satan enters into a man, that is the depths of wickedness. Jesus said of Judas, it would have been better for that man if he'd never been born. Jesus calls Judas the son of perdition. Perdition, one who is destined to perish.